Okay, we are ready to move on to item number 3. I'm going to bring in some of our folks who are going to be presenting. Go ahead and bring in Chief Manley as well. Okay, Ms. Olivares, are you there? I know it takes a second for the cameras to turn on and everything.
Yes. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Kim Olivares. I'm the Chief Performance Officer. Thank you for having us here today. I'll be kicking off the very beginning part of item 3. My part is very brief, and the remaining of it will be handled by Sarah and Brian and Carrie, because the main focus will be on the release of the 2019 report. So thank you for pulling up that presentation. Okay. So if you're able to, I'm not sure if I take control or you.
I'm in charge. So.
Okay, got it. Okay. Okay. If you wouldn't mind, go to the next slide, please. So the reason I'm here today is to talk about how all of this relates to Strategic Direction 2023. And if you'll actually go to the next slide. As you will all recall, back in June, there was resolution number 50 that included various pieces of direction related to SD23 measures. More specifically, it established 0 racial disparity goals within the safety outcome, and in particular related to the motor vehicle stops, citations and arrests resulting from those stops, and any use of force incidents. It also included direction for staff to use the joint analysis on APD racial profiling data to serve as the baseline measurement for a very specific measure related to motor vehicle stops within Strategic 2023. As well as use of forces, incidents, and officer-involved deaths. You can go to the next slide. So what was our process to address those pieces of the resolution specifically? First, we assembled leadership as well as supporting staff from Office of Police Oversight, Equity, Innovation, Police Department, and then my team as well, to collaborate on the dashboard content and visualizations that we would be including for these safety outcome measures. For each of the SD23 measures, and for the development of them, we typically had a very specific template for each of the departments to use so that there's some consistency in the content and the layout for each of those measures. So we generally utilize that template in this case, but we also recognize that this measure had some special or unique aspects to it that we needed to take into consideration. So we did make some adjustments to meet those needs. We also want to make sure that we were incorporating key information from the Reimagining Public Safety website, the various council resolutions, and the racial profiling reports in the measure content. So when you go and look at the actual measure in the dashboard, you're able to see all of that information, various measure background points, and then you're able to really do a breakdown of each of the outcomes for the motor vehicle stops. For example, if it results in a citation or a warning or arrest, but then also access the raw data and dig into that further. Next slide, please. So in terms of what's next, what you actually see on the left of the slide is a small screenshot of the measure that exists on the dashboard that went live today for this measure. For the next steps, we will be incorporating the results of the 2019 Joint Analysis Report, which it involves not only content, but also making sure we're updating the various visualizations. Because 2018 was used as that base data for the measure, we didn't have anything in terms of trending analysis. But now that the 2019 report is being released, we'll be able to incorporate visualizations that demonstrate that trending, as well as analysis and content context around each of those visualizations accordingly. We're also going to use our experience from building out this measure together as a kind of a baseline or a foundation for how we can make updates and approach the development of other related measures. So for example, previously, the measures about use of force and in proportion to number of arrests was already developed, as well as crimes against persons, property, and society. So we can go back and take another look at those and see what can we do to improve those in the same spirit as what was specifically directed for this measure within Resolution 50. We also need to work on the final component of Measure SD1, which is the overall arrest compared to race. So we still have some work to do, but we wanted to make sure to bring to y'all today where we have this measure live for folks to look at. I believe that you may have been sent a series of links. I'm not sure if that made it to you or not. Beautiful. Okay, so in the interest of hoping that everything loads quickly and correctly, we just have them open up on 3 separate tabs. So this is the basic, the homepage, performance.austin.texas.gov, where you're able to see all of the measures for SD23. And if you scroll down a little bit, you'll find where you're able to click on the safety outcome. And if you go to the next tab, that's what happens if you click on the safety outcome. And if you scroll down to indicator category D, administration of justice, fair administration of justice, you'll see in the top left corner, it looks a little, the square that has information and insights for disproportionality analysis, you'll notice it does look a little bit different than the others. And the reason being because this particular page is actually pulling together quite a bit more information than our typical measures, because there are so many different breakdowns for each of the different outcomes of a motor vehicle stop. We're not able to display it with that target the same way. And if you were to click on that, it would open up what you see on the final tab. And you see where we have all the information about the reimagining public safety, the ability to link in to see the resolution content, the joint report. And then here you see measure cards that tell you how many motor vehicle stops result in a citation or a warning or field observation or an arrest. And if you continue to scroll down, you'll see where we have the actual disproportionality analysis, where you're able to see by race how that varies compared to actual population. And you'll see that we specifically noted the council's direction about that the goal or the target for each of those to be zero disproportionality. And for each of these things, you're able to dig into the raw data and learn a little bit more about each of the individual situations that may have taken place. But we're really happy to be able to put this out here to the public today, and welcome any questions or feedback that the committee or council members have. And so if you do have those, I'm happy to take those now, or I'm happy to pass it on over to Farah and crew to take on the rest of the presentation.
First, I want to acknowledge that Mayor Adler and Councilmember Alter have joined the meeting. Thank you all for being with us. Any questions for Kim specifically on the SD23 site and the metrics? Okay, let's move on.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kim. Farah, are you there?
Yes, I am. Good afternoon. Carrie is up first.
Oh,
great.
Carrie's first, sorry.
Good afternoon, council members and Mayor Adler. My name is Carrie O'Connor. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer, and I'm going to talk to you just a little bit today about the methodology within the racial profiling report. If you could go to the next screen. So the report for the 2019 racial profiling, we looked at 2019 motor vehicle stop data from the City of Austin Open Data Portal To conduct an analysis on proportionality, we used the City of Austin population data from the 2010 census. This data has the lowest margin of error, which is why we used that particular data source. We also conducted a disparate outcomes analysis for those decisions that happen after a traffic stop. If you go to the next screen, we'll talk a little bit more about that. So when we talk about disproportionality, we're talking about the ratio between the percentage of persons in a particular racial or ethnic group at a particular decision point or experiencing an event compared to the percentage of that group in the population. When we talk about disparate impact, we're describing a situation in which an outcome or an adverse effect falls disproportionately on a racial or ethnic group compared to other racial or ethnic groups. And when we're analyzing disparate impact on the decision points after a stop, such as a citation, arrest, or warning, we're borrowing from legally available analytical frameworks where the relevant population base for that adverse disparate impact is the subset of the population that is affected by the decision. And I just want to say that it's to great credit to the City of Austin that we're able to borrow these legally available analytical frameworks that are normally reserved for the courts, to use them instead as a performance measure where we can set these audacious goals for our city and measure progress towards them. Next screen. For racial disproportionality in 2019, Black African American drivers were the most overrepresented group in motor vehicle stops, making up approximately 8% of the Austin population, but 14% of the motor vehicle stops, 25% of searches, and 25% of the arrests. And we're the only demographic group to receive more high discretion than low discretion searches. Hispanic Latino drivers made up 33% of motor vehicle stops and 44% of motor vehicle stops that resulted in a citation, but they comprised 31% of Austin's adult population. White drivers were the most underrepresented in total motor vehicle stops. Asian drivers were slightly underrepresented in total motor vehicle stops. Next slide. When we talk about disparate outcomes, once someone is pulled over, white, Caucasian, and Asian drivers receive a higher percentage of warnings or field observations at 63 and 64% respectively. Black and African American, Hispanic Latino drivers receive higher percentages of searches that result in arrest at 10% and 7% respectively. Hispanic Latinos receive the highest percentage of citations at 44%. Black African Americans were 3 times more likely to be searched and approximately 3 times more likely to be arrested than white Caucasian drivers. Next slide. Now we turn it over to Director Farah Muscadin for more on the data analysis.
Thank you, Carrie. Good afternoon. My name is Farah Muscadin. I'm the Director of the Office of Police Oversight. Thank you, Chair Flanagan, and to committee members and council members, Mayor Adler, for the opportunity to present this to you today. I also want to thank my colleagues, Carrie and Brian Oakes, for joining in this joint report. It has been an interesting journey. The Office of Police Monitor has generally done a racial profiling report, but there hadn't been one since 2015. And so we thought the lens that OPO and equity and innovation could provide is important in this conversation, particularly as, you know, the sentiment in the community and the lived experience of those in the community have talked a lot about racial profiling. And so we wanted to be able to speak to that and look specifically at what the data says. You will get a full copy of the report that will be released this afternoon, but given, you know, the time, I wanted to really just give you a high level overview of some of the key points in our analysis in the report. Next slide, please. So generally, this slide talks about disproportionality. And again, Carrie did a fabulous job with explaining it, where we look at the number of stops and the percentage of each particular race, ethnicities portion of the population. And here, what this chart is telling us is that for African Americans, they experience 6% overrepresentation as compared to their portion of the population. Hispanic Latino, 2% overrepresentation. Asian, 3% underrepresentation when we look at their portion of the population, and white Caucasian, 6%. So we do see some change from 2018 to 2019 as it relates to African American and white drivers. But again, we still see the disproportionality, particularly with African American and Latino drivers. The next slide. Now, this slide here is explaining the exact same information in the previous slide, but here we give you the numbers. So we give you the numbers in terms of looking at the stops that occurred in 2019 by the 4 most populous race ethnicity groups. And then we give you the percentage of the stop, of their particular stop, their portion of the population, and then you can see how we did the math with looking at over and under representation. So this is just another way of displaying the previous slide in terms of looking at the overall portionality of motor vehicle stops. Next slide, please. Now this slide we put in here actually is a result of our presentation from the Judicial Committee in February. Mayor Pro Tem specifically asked us, well, what are the reasons for the stop? And so that wasn't included in our initial report, so we made sure to include it in this report. And it was a pretty common question that we got from community after that report was released. So when we look at the reason for the stops at 2019, 75% of them were moving traffic violations. So what that means is speeding, failure to stay in lanes, failure to signal. And that was the primary reason for vehicle stops in 2019. And then we looked at, obviously you see 0.2% for pre-existing knowledge, that generally speaking a warrant. Next slide, please. Here, what we did is we looked at the stops that resulted in arrest, and of those stops that resulted in arrest, what was the reason for the stop? Okay, so I'll just say that one more time. We looked at the arrests that occurred from a stop, and we wanted to know, of those arrests, what was the reason for the initial stop? And when we looked at that for 2019, 68% of them were moving traffic violations, 28% other violation of other law, violation of law other than traffic, and then 3% pre-existing knowledge, for example, a warrant. Next slide. Here's where we noticed an increase in the disproportionality, particularly as it relates to searches. We saw that there was an increase in disproportionality of searches as it relates to African Americans, going from 17 to 18% from 2018 to 2019. The number stayed the same for Hispanic and Latino, and the same for Asian, and it slightly increased for white Caucasian from 2018 to 2019. And I'll go a little bit further into searches in the next slide. Chair, you may not remember, but I remember because this stuck out to you most when we presented this to you in the Judicial Committee in February. We look at high and low discretion searches. And let me just quickly explain the difference. High discretion searches are searches that are pretty much kind of up to the officer in terms of if there's probable cause, consent, or for example, for safety. Low discretion searches are the type of searches that because of state law, because they are required to do a search. So for example, subsequent to an arrest, that is a low discretion search. Officers are able to search the person, vehicle subsequent to an arrest. So when we look at this particular chart, again, it shows that African Americans are more likely to experience high discretion searches than low discretion searches. And it's the only race ethnicity group that has that higher percentage of high discretion searches. And this number, when we looked at compared to 2018, this number increased by 7.7%. And so that we do know that this is an area that we need to look into further and assist the police department in really addressing this this concern, because obviously we're seeing that African Americans experience much more high discretion searches than any of the other race or ethnicity groups that we looked at. Next slide. Now, this is an additional analysis that we added to the report. So we looked at outcomes by each race and ethnicity in terms of what happened subsequent to their stop. And so when we look at the Asian population, again, in the context of 2019, 34% of the time they received citations, 64% of the time they received warnings and field observations, and 2% arrests. When we look at the African American population, 55% received warnings and field observations, 35% received citations, and 10% received arrests. Next slide, please. When we look at Hispanic and Latino population, 48% received warnings and field observations, 44% citations, and 7% arrests. And then when we look at the white Caucasian population, 63% received warnings and field observations, 33% citations, and 4% arrests. And so when we looked at the 4 most populous race ethnicity groups, this is where the data showed that African Americans are 3 times more likely to be searched and approximately 3 times more likely to be arrested than their white counterparts. Next slide, please. Now we did a geographic analysis, and we're looking at primarily warnings and field observations and also arrests. And as you know, the police department has divided the city into sectors. And so what this illustrates is that in the Adam and Baker sector, there were a higher concentration of warnings and field observations. And then in the Edward and Charlie sector, there were a higher concentration of arrests. I do want to note that we're unable to track citations. The department doesn't have the geo mapping in their documentation to do that. It is something that we put in our recommendations because it would be helpful to see geographically how citations are mapped out. That is the last slide before I turn it out to Brian, but I would like to say that I think it is really important that we look at racial profiling and the disproportionality. And I know that I can speak for Carrie and Brian that we are looking forward and want to be partners with the police department to address it, because fundamentally our goal is not only to reach zero disparity, but also to have equity in policing. And Brian, I'll turn it over to Brian to talk about the recommendations.
Thank you, Farah. Good afternoon, everyone. I'll briefly go over some of the recommendations that we have in the full report that you'll be receiving today. And prior to the pandemic, we actually had an opportunity to host a community conversation with community members around the 2018 racial profiling report and the results. And we use a lot of that feedback that we got from that community conversation into the recommendations we have for this year. And as you read the recommendations for this year, you'll also see that some of them carry over from last year. So if we can go to the next slide, I'll review those recommendations with you at a high level. I will say that our first and most important recommendation that's in this report centers around acknowledgement. And acknowledgement is important because I fundamentally believe that we cannot be a part of helping you fix a problem if we can't get you to admit that there's a problem. And I will be open and honest to tell you that a lot of the feedback that we received from the community conversation from community members was a defensiveness with our police department in terms of really receiving the racial profiling data and the report. And one of the things that they talked about was that as a city, how do we sort of unequivocally really sort of step in and own the data that's in the report so that we can really move forward with being able to bring forth solutions to how we eliminate this disparity and bring it to zero. Another important area of the recommendation centers around the need for community engagement. And, one of the principles that we are really trying to introduce across all of our departments is that as we do that engagement, how do we really center the people that are most harmed, are most on the end of the negative impact? And in this case, how do we really sort of engage African Americans and Latino community members around how we actually move forward to really bring forth solutions to how we eliminate these disparities in traffic stops and arrests and searches that we see. If you go to the next slide, we also feel that it's really important for us to focus on establishing benchmarks. And the benchmarks are important because it really begins to build us a roadmap of how we actually get to zero. And in those benchmarks, I would ask, what are our interventions? What are the plans that we're putting in place? How do we feel these interventions or different pilots that we may try will actually sort of help us reduce the disparity to get us to zero? But ultimately being able to establish a benchmark and a pathway so that we can actually get to meet the goal that the council set for us in the Resolution 50. And then commitment is really important. A lot of the community members in the community conversation we had made comments around wanting to see something in writing from our police department in terms of their commitment to really get to this goal of zero. And then the last recommendation that we explore in the report is the need for us to really get upstream. And is there an opportunity within our officer training to intervene early on and to really sort of acknowledge and address the role of officer discretion in racial disparities? And is that an active part of our training academy where we're starting early on in terms of how we address that issue? I think that as you look at the data today, the high discretionary searches and the disparity for African American motorists in that area is really illustrative of what happens at those discretion points for our officers and drivers in the city. I think it's a good illustration of that. And so that's a high level overview of the recommendations that are in the report. We definitely would welcome more opportunity to probably come back and talk at length about those recommendations as you have an opportunity to review that report. And then I think now we'll open it up for any questions.
Council members, do we have questions for Brian or Farah? Gary? Councilmember Harper Madison?
I only have a couple questions. I'm more have statements of gratitude for Farah and for Carrie and for Brian for the hard work that I know y'all poured into this, producing this data and producing these recommendations. I really just wanted to say I thoroughly appreciate the hard work. This was totally necessary. You guys may or may not notice this, but this is almost to the year anniversary of when we brought forward the resolution that sort of started this ball rolling. And then, just a couple days ago, the just over $1 million that we asked for auditing the academy was approved as well. And that process is starting to. So it just feels like everything is lining up just so. And I really appreciate that. It feels comprehensive. And so the one question I would have had was, how do we, like one of the last benchmarks, it had training and intervention. And so I kind of had a how do we question, but then it occurred to me, if we are specifically addressing the audit around training, I wonder if that information could help to influence the response here. But just out of curiosity, did y'all have any sort of initial ideas about how do we address it at the training and interventive level? I'm not sure who I'm asking. Anybody?
I think we may all chime in and have ideas about it. I think from a racial equity standpoint, looking at the strength of our training around that in our training academy, and how do we really sort of emphasize that principle, even on the front end in terms of who we select for academy is even important. I agree with you. I think that the work that the consultant is going to do on the audit with the training academy is a part of that work. will help us really sort of identify some of those opportunities moving forward. And there's been some pockets of work around that, so for example, my office is a part of working with a project with community members who are doing a part of a equity video review of some of the training academy materials and providing feedback on that as well. And so we hope that that information that comes out of that report and the review and the work that they were doing will also help inform the training academy portion too.
Mayor Pro Tem?
I'm sorry if I missed this from the beginning, but I remember, is this a new report for 2019 and what we received? I feel like sometimes a month feels like, 2 years as a council member. When we asked these questions, I remember we were in person the last time we talked about this, so it may have been 2 years ago. Was that presentation on 18 data? Okay.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah. So we didn't anticipate doing 2 reports in 1 year. So when we presented in January, we presented the 2018 data. And so the police department is required by state law to release their racial profiling data by March, and it's usually the end of February of each year. And so after Resolution 50 was passed and setting the goal for zero disparity, we felt it was really important for us to get the 2019 report done in this year so that we could have that trend data and have another analysis. Going forward, we will do this, we will release this report in the summer of each year.
Okay.
And so it was really not our intention to do 2 in 1 year, but I'm glad we were able to do that because it is like Councilmember Harper Madison said, all falling in place.
And the slide that said that 68% of arrests were from moving violations, I guess I asked a similar question that you remember from last time, but do I guess digging into that, do we know of that 68% what the arrests were for? Like, does the data get as detailed as they were pulled over for speeding and 50% were arrested for a warrant or, oh no, but that was an entirely separate percentage, right?
Yeah, so what we looked at is like the universe of stops in 2019, those that led to arrest, we looked at what was the initial reason for the stop in the first place. And that number is 68% was a moving traffic violation. So that's anywhere from speeding, failure to keep in lanes, that we didn't look at what the subsequent arrest was for. We didn't look at that in this report, but that's definitely something. That's why these conversations are so helpful, because this report has grown from the last report because of the feedback that we've gotten. We've introduced more data analysis into it, but that is something that we can look into in terms of after the stop, if there was arrest, what was the basis for the arrest?
Okay. Thank you.
Mayor Pro Tem, to that point, that is a critical piece of information, and we talked about that last year as well. And I agree that if we're going to look at the disparities, we need to look at those disparities are the result of officers' discretion versus the disparities that are the result that the likelihood of the fact that a warrant existed for the arrest, and therefore it wasn't a discretionary arrest.
Okay, but you're saying, I guess I'm trying to understand the 2 different kinds. So there was, in the pie chart, there was a percentage that it led to an arrest. Is that because are the officers there was a percentage that said they were stopped because of a previous warrant. So is it like the officer runs their plates and then, so they haven't done anything, like there's no moving violation involved, they just run someone's plates? And can we do that? We just run plates without any moving violation?
The officer has the ability to run plates, but that 0.2% is most likely we were looking for a subject for a warrant and maybe we were doing surveillance on them, or maybe the officer is familiar with the person. That's why it's such a small number. But the other number, when we talk about the disproportionality in arrests from traffic stops, we do need to do that extra layer of digging. And that's what we're working on, is to show those arrests, how many were discretionary versus how many were driven by the person had a warrant once they were stopped for a traffic violation.
Okay, so we don't know what that number is of that 68%. How many of them were arrested because of a previous warrant?
That is not included in this analysis, no.
Well,
But
we
do you-
do. We do know, because in 2019, of the ones that were arrested, 3% were pre-existing knowledge, which is more likely a warrant.
No, of the 68% though?
No. That's of all the people who were stopped and an arrest ensued in 2019.
Okay.
So of those that were arrested, 3% of those were because of a warrant.
Okay, so then it's even, okay, then it's not a lot.
No, but that's a separate category, though. That's those with the pre-existing. It still doesn't answer for the 68%, how many of those actually had a warrant. They're two separate sets of data. So no, they're not, that's not the same thing.
Okay, that would be, if somebody can find that out, that would be a helpful piece of data.
If I might jump in, Mayor Pro Tem, because I had a similar question on that.
Okay.
It might be useful, Farah, because I'm hearing the data gets more complicated the deeper we go. Instead of adding a lot of stuff to a full report, if we might just deep dive in a few of these areas in the short term over the next couple of months. That way it'll help narrow the frame of analysis, and we can add fewer variables as we get more answers. So just for example, taking the pie chart, that chart 2 on slide 16, and taking that 68% and breaking it out so we get a better understanding of how those, what started as a moving violation, how they concluded. And not waiting for the next big report, but just maybe deep diving on that one question might provide a little bit of clarity. Because I think I understand what you're saying, Chief, where the pre-existing knowledge are the ones where there wasn't a moving violation. They for some reason knew, this 3%, that there was a warrant, and that's why they were stopped. In the 68%, there was a moving violation, and it's possible a big percentage of those after the moving violation reason, it was discovered they had a warrant. Or whatever that is, but that's where the deep dive I think will be helpful. Sorry to interrupt, but please continue, Mayor Pro Tem.
No problem. Since you're on, Chief Manley, I remember we had this discussion last time about the acknowledging part, and I 100% understand you wanting to defend any actions by your officers. I totally get it, but it seemed like last time there wasn't that acknowledgement, and I'm just curious if now you believe that there is room to improve and room to change it, because even just looking at even without digging into the numbers, when you look at that map that shows different parts of town and the warnings that are given, that's kind of that's hard to look at when you see that it from that map. It looks like Southeast Austin never gets a warning if I read that map correctly. And so I'm just curious if you can, if you wanted to say anything about that this time, because last time, with all due respect, it was a very defensive response. And I get it. We're all public servants. As council members, we get criticized all the time, but as public servants, that we need to be open to that criticism and want to do better and get to a place where then we can, if it's a policy issue, we can say, well, we'll have to agree to disagree on that. But I was just curious if you wanted to show any acknowledgement and room for improvement.
Well, certainly, Mayor Pro Tem. And again, the defensiveness is not about the need to always defend my department, because we're not perfect. And there are issues that we are addressing and have been addressing for years in our community. I will agree that there is work that needs to be done, and that work is underway, and we are actively engaging to the extent we're either allowed or invited. And I am actually pleased to see that although it is a slight improvement, that there was an improvement made last year compared to 2018 in some of these areas of disproportionality. So I do think that we're headed in the right direction. I think that we have made progress. And I think that with the continued efforts of everyone that's involved in this process, we can continue along this path.
Okay, I appreciate that. I also I'd add, I often hear in these kinds of discussions, people will say stuff like, well, just do what you're told, do what the officer tells you to do, and it's always strange to me that the responsibility gets put on the person that's not the professional in that situation. When people, if I get pulled over, I get nervous. It is a very valid reaction for people to not act 100%, to get nervous, to get scared, and especially when in an environment where incredibly awful things happen sometimes, in traffic stops for certain parts of our community. So I certainly hope that as we try to get better, that is a big part of our training for our officers, that they're the professional in the situation. And, as council members, we get called the most awful names, get sent the most awful emails, but we have to be the professional in those. And I really hope that we are having those discussions with our police officers as we train them and having them understand that they are public servants. And I know it's a hard job. I know it is, but I certainly hope we can continue working towards reducing these what I believe are racial biases in our police.
And we are committed to that work. And the only thing that I'll add is that at the commencement speech at our most recent cadet graduation, as I say it, if not all, most of them, I actually do remind the graduating class that remember, in every circumstance you are in, you are the trained professional. So that is something that we do reiterate, and that I am in complete agreement with you all.
Council members, other questions? Councilmember Kitchen?
I just wanted to see if we could get a copy of the slide deck. I didn't see it posted, so.
I think the slides were emailed to council offices around 8:30 this morning, so they should be in your inbox. That's what staff told us. I'll have my staff follow up on that again.
Yeah, if you could have a follow-up, that would be great. I'd appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Sorry, Councilmember Tovo. Maybe.
Thank you.
Tovo, there you go.
Yeah, thanks. I have a question for Farah. Farah, you paused and explained this, but I'm still having trouble distinguishing between the information on slide 5 and the information on slide 6. So if you wouldn't mind spending another few minutes on that.
Okay, and this is the slides that talk about the disproportionality.
I'm sorry, yes, this is analysis, the reason for the the 15 is entitled Reason for the Motor Vehicle Stop in 2019.
Yep.
And then on the next one is the pie chart that talks about the reason for stop that resulted in arrest by race, ethnicity. And so I'm struggling with understanding those two slides in juxtaposition to one another and how they relate. And also on the pie chart on 16 in particular, I guess I need some examples of what would be violations of law other than traffic. I didn't see in the previous slide a category that might encompass violations other than traffic violations. So.
Okay, so I believe this is slide 15 that talks about the reason for the motor vehicle stop. This was a question that we got in February, just in terms of when we did the analysis for the racial profiling, we were asked, well, why were people being stopped? And so what this slide talks about is 75% of the time when there were, when we look at the total number of stops for 2019, there's just over 139,000. So when we looked at that number, 104,000, just over 104,000 were because of a moving traffic violation. So that's the universe of motor vehicle stops and why people were stopped in the first place. We looked for an example of violation of law other than traffic. I might have to defer to Chief on that because we really couldn't find a good example of that to give you. It was a question that we got that we couldn't find an example for that. But when we look at the next slide, what I understand why it's a little confusing. So let me just maybe put it in terms of an example. So we know that in the universe of stops for 2019, there were 139,000, just over 129,000. Let's say I am one of the 139. I am stopped and subsequently arrested. We wanted to look at, okay, of those people that were arrested from that 129,000, what was the reason for their stops? And in that particular case, said that 68% of that was for a moving traffic violation. So we cut down the 139 universe to the universe of those that were arrested subsequent to stop to see, okay, when we looked at that group, what was the reason for their stop of those who got arrested? Does that help a little bit?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
That makes perfect sense. Thank you so much for spending a few more minutes on that. I really appreciate it and understand it much better now. And then my only other question is the field observation. What is a field observation? I assume it's something like a warning, something like a warning, but I'm not familiar with that term.
Yeah, it is just like a warning. I'm gonna see if I can quickly find the PD definition of it in our report. But I think it is just like a warning.
I can help if you would like, Farah.
Yeah, please, Chief.
Sure. We require our officers to document anytime they stop an individual. So let's say we stop someone and we do not issue them a citation, or we stop them, say on the side of the road and talk to them, and there's not going to be as a result of that, such as an offense report. We fill out a field observation so that we can keep track of who we're stopping for all of the demographic reasons and reporting that we need that information for.
Thank you very much, Chief.
You have.
Other questions? Farah, let me ask one question, then I'll go to you, Councilmember Alter. I'm curious if there's any similar analysis of police departments in other cities. Do we have a sense of how this lines up? Are there parts of this that are uniquely Austin? Are there parts of this that are more kind of like policing as a concept faces this data issue and the resulting challenges in overcoming it? Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, no, I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but this is not unique to Austin at all whatsoever. Pretty much there's disproportionality for those that do this analysis across the country. There was a report earlier this year from Travis County that showed disproportionality in terms of their traffic stops. The state of California did a whole statewide report on racial profiling, and the numbers showed the same of higher disproportionality for African Americans and Latinos. And so this is something that I believe every single police department struggles with. It's also just kind of about the systemic issues in law enforcement. But I'm part of the reason why I'm so passionate about this work and very assertive about it is because I just feel so strongly that we can address it in Austin. I really do. I really feel like Austin can be the leader in terms of turning the direction in policing and so that it's more equitable.
Thank you, Farah. And I hold that in my mind as kind of permission to innovate. This isn't about us uniquely failing or some kind of unique failing in the way we do business as a city. These are large systemic problems, and there's a lot of cities that are seeking to address it. And I like the idea that we might be the ones to really move that needle, and hope that's exactly what we're all trying to do. Councilmember Alter.
Thank you. I don't have a copy of the slides, so I'm not going to be able to be as specific to what's on the slides yet. But I think it's really important that we do this type of data analysis, and so we understand where we're not doing well and where there are opportunities. I wanted to just clarify from the chief's comments, and as we're looking at this, all of this data is from before we started talking about it, from the report that was released earlier this year. So if there was an improvement from 2018 to 2019, it has nothing to do with changes that we put into effect once this was something that was more apparent through the data. Is that correct? Because the 2020 data is not what you analyzed, and you did your report in, I think it was January of this year, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct? So, I mean, what we're seeing so far, it's good that it moved in the right direction, but we don't have any data that shows that any change at this point is having an effect. Is that correct? Do I have the sequence correct?
If that question's for me, yes, you do have the timing correct in that we received the report on the 2018 data in January of this year, subsequent to when all of the data in the report you're receiving today would have already happened. So we were already making improvements before that report even came out, or the data that was already going in the right direction prior to receiving that report in January. So yes, your timing.
Sure, and I want to acknowledge that, but the reason I'm asking that is that I think it would be useful, and I apologize if this has already been stated, but I didn't have it clearly. What steps have we taken to change the trajectory so that when we're now looking at 2020, correcting for the pandemic, however you do that we can understand, what are some of the things that we changed in 2020, and hopefully there'll be additional changes that are happening in 2021, but we won't be able to measure those in our 2020 data. So what has actually changed? We had some discussions about what we might change, but you mentioned that you've already taken steps. Can you outline those clearly for us?
Sure, and I think this is the whole cause and effect. Where do we best invest our time and efforts to have the change that we want? And I don't know that we're ever going to get to a point where we can say A equals B, but I think the fact that there is so much focus on this issue, both nationally and locally, I think that we have invested over the years in training, whether it be the implicit bias training that we went through a few years back, whether it be the work that we've done with the Undoing Racism workshops that we've put a majority of our command staff and training staff through. And then just that generates just conversation as well. So to me, I think the awareness is one issue that we have to look at and try to evaluate how much impact did that have. And then as we go forward, I know this was one of the recommendations coming out of the report as well, is that strategic plan. And I think there's so much work being done in so many lanes right now as we look at the police department, both the reviews that we did on our training academy with our own staff, our PhD, the external review that we did, the video reviews that are being done right now. And then you all obviously just hired Kroll to come in and do another review. I think that's where we now have to focus our efforts, is in making sure that there's a synergy there with all this work being done as we build this strategic plan, so that when we're talking about this next year and we really want to tie cause and effect, that we'll have something to point back to. But for now, I do think it's just some of the training that we've put our officers through, along with just really the attention that's being paid to this issue locally and nationally. But to have a hard and fast data set or something we could point back to, we just don't have that yet.
Thank you. And then in terms of, if we were to think about how these changes were being made at the cadet level versus the officers who are out in the field, I heard you mention the Undoing Racism training. What were the other things that for those who are already in the field?
So the ongoing training, we bring the officers back every 2-year cycle for training. I think the specific difference you're seeing out in the field that may impact some of these disparities is policy changes that we've made, both on our own and also in coordination with you as a governing body here, specifically in the area of low-level enforcement of certain types of offenses. We could go as far back as the juvenile curfew and as recent as our changes to how we enforce marijuana law here. So I think that from the officers on the street perspective, I think it's more for them just policy changes we have put in place. And then as we continue our reviews of the academy and our curricula, where do those opportunities lie to actually train the officers that are already in service? And I do know one of the recommendations, I believe it's in this year's report as well, specifically addresses training for those officers that are already in service. And so we will have to look at what our opportunities are there as well.
Thank you. I don't know that this can be documented, quantitatively in any way, but I do think it would be useful as part of the discussion in the reporting or whatever, to be able to document what steps have happened or in motion that might relate to that, particularly if we have an eye for being innovative and being able to provide a model for other cities, as we move forward. And I don't know if the report is the right place for that, but being able to try to understand these are levers that may have affected it. Obviously, we're not going to get down to the fine grain of this one thing was the solution or whatnot, but having that suite of tools documented, I think might be helpful moving forward. Thank you.
Some of the, Farah, when we get into the full report and we're not just looking at PowerPoint slides, are we going to see more slices of this data in different ways?
Oh, absolutely. We expanded our analysis to include gender, looking at stops by gender, and there are more disproportionality as it relates to African American and Latino males. We also looked at the specific outcomes per race, ethnicity. And so we added much more analysis in this version than we did in our first round. And that was primarily from community feedback and also council feedback. And so I think that's what makes it so great is that we're responding to the community in terms of what they're asking us to look into the data to see what it says.
Do you have some of this analysis broken down further by patrol region? Because you have the map, but what strikes me about the map that's in the presentation is that it's a raw number and not a percentage. So I don't really know, right, how those numbers compare to each other.
Yep, we do have that in the report. Okay. It's broken down by number of arrests by sectors and also by, I believe, field observations as well, warnings and field observations.
Yeah. I do remember seeing some of this back when we were doing judicial committee and thinking that, as much as my constituents, and my council district's entirely within the Adams sector, and as much as my constituents have told me they want to see more traffic stops and more motor vehicle enforcement, I don't think they're expecting them to be warnings. Unless they're the ones that are pulled over, then they definitely want the warning. But if it's anybody else, they're expecting people to get a ticket. So it is, and I kind of remember thinking then that the data kind of shows the opposite of what these parts of town seem to be asking for. And you've got some parts of town that in large part are wanting more enforcement, and you're seeing more warnings, and then some parts of town where they're wanting to see more kind of community partnership from officers, and they're seeing more arrests. And obviously there's a ton of detail to dig into for those reasons, but just as a high level blush, I think more information to dig into that report. And then if I see any gaps or any further questions, any council member, of course, can reach out to your office or to the chief and see if there's more info. Other questions on this report? Councilmember Kassar?
Two questions. The first one around the data, and to your point, Chair, about addresses. We've been talking about this for a while every time we get one of the reports about isolating what has to do potentially more with race or ethnicity and what does not. So I know that sometimes y'all check the data on like stops at night versus the daytime, assuming that it's harder to determine a driver's race or ethnicity at night. But that sometimes that information may not be that useful because we're so segregated that you might generally be able to, regardless of whether it's day or night, you're more often than not still going to be stopping people of similar race or ethnicity based on neighborhood. So something that I remember came up in our public safety committee meeting, I think back in 2015 or 2016, was looking at racial disproportionality of stops of people, for example, people of color in neighborhoods that are segregated or more heavily white neighborhoods, for example, or the other way around, in order to better examine racial disproportionality that might not be tied to, the way that the neighborhood is patrolled, right? There were questions of, are you going to have more stops just because that neighborhood is patrolled more, or does it have to do with potentially implicit bias? So have we gotten a hold yet, or can we drill down to look at in a neighborhood? Do you see more disproportionate stops, for example, of people of color, not based on how heavily the area is patrolled, but actually based potentially more independently on race? If you look at that, does that make sense? Is that clear? I feel like it took me longer to ask the question than I wanted.
I think I might be able to help. One of the things that we added in this report that wasn't in the last report is that we created a Tableau dashboard where you can go in by zip code and track motor vehicle stops by race, time, zip code, and intersection. And so it's interactive. And so you can type in your zip code and see kind of what the stops were. And I think we had to clean the data a lot to be able to put that together. And we wanted the community to be able to see kind of in terms of motor vehicle stops, what's happening in their community. I'm looking forward to feedback on that, because that is a new addition to the report that we added, just so that the community themselves can drill down to see what's happening in their particular neighborhoods.
I think that's exactly what I was asking about, because then the follow-up question is, does the disproportionality that you all are reporting, does that generally hold from neighborhood to neighborhood, regardless of whether there's major roads people speed on, regardless of the overall racial makeup of the neighborhood? Does that disproportionality continue to hold across neighborhoods, or do you see it dip and flow in different neighborhoods?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that Chair Flanagan talked about that we can drill down in. And I think when I take a step back from the report, because there is a lot of data in there, drilling down by neighborhoods, I really want to drill down on the high discretion searches, because that was a red flag. And then also what Mayor Pro Tem talked about in terms of, and also Chair Flanagan talked about drilling down to determine what was the reason for the arrest or what people were arrested for post a stop. I think those are three critical areas we could drill down and look into and come back to the committee to report what we find.
I think that would be really useful. Because my hope is that we go from here to to an action plan or to a set of recommended steps to address this, whether it's how it is we're patrolling in particular areas, or what it is that we're emphasizing stops for, or whatever it is that the next steps are. I think we're probably going to have to drill down to a deeper level of information to get to that. My second question was about high discretion stops. If I remember correctly, a few years ago when we got this report, consent searches were actually a really small portion of our number of searches. But based on this data, it looks like that might be on the rise, or maybe I'm misremembering. I see you shaking your head, so please let me know. Is there a difference between consent searches and these high discretion searches? Have we been seeing any sort of change in the number of high discretion searches we do over a period of time?
Yeah, and Aaron, I do think that's a very important point, as you asked me, because what do you consider a high discretion search? What's included in that are one of the categories is contraband in plain sight. And so if an officer stopped someone and there's contraband in plain sight, say a firearm potential, or say drugs or something like that, does that officer really have discretion whether or not they're going to search for that? I would think the community's expectation is if we have contraband in plain sight that we're going to act on that. Similarly, what is considered a high discretion search, as in the officer has discretion, is a probable cause search, meaning the officer has probable cause to believe a crime has been committed. And so that's included in that large bucket of high discretion searches. I would think that the community would want an officer that has probable cause to believe that a crime is being committed to conduct that search. But we do have to be aware that we have to make sure that bias isn't playing into that officer's belief that there is probable cause. So I think that's one you have to be a little cautious with. So it is important to highlight that these high discretion searches are much, much more than the consent search, where an officer is just asking to search someone because they want to search someone. I don't remember the absolute number in this year's report, but it's very, very low because we've set the bar very high for all of the thresholds an officer has to meet before they can just do a consent search. So I do think that's important as you're looking at all the data to realize what's considered a high discretion search is a very wide range of categories.
Thanks, Chief. That clears that up because I do remember that number being very low. And so good to understand and hear that high discretion search is different than consent search. But yeah, I think of most interest to me from this report is how we get to action steps that are shared by, that OPO and equity office feel good about and that APD feels good about and are ready to work on based on sort of, I think the top line data helps us acknowledge the overall issue, but the drilling down, I think, is what's important for us to then be able to know what we can agree on as steps of what to do about this. So thank you.
I found the tableau, I think, Farah, that you were referencing. If my laptop will share it. Does this look right?
Yep, that's it.
So I just, for example's sake, clicked on my own zip code, 78729, and you can see across the bottom the very low ratio of Black population in 29, but a significantly larger bar in terms of motor vehicle stops. And so there's clearly a disparity there. It doesn't really have it by percentage, it's just raw numbers, but you can dig into this data. Really interesting stuff, even distribution of stops by day, which I think Councilmember Kassar was something you were kind of referencing as what might be different in different zip codes, but really interesting data. It was not easy to find in the report. It was like buried in a paragraph. It was on anyone who's in that PDF will find it on page 25, linked in the middle of a paragraph, but you can find it. Other comments or questions? Councilmember Harper Madison.
Thank you. This was one that I actually had earlier. Acceptable benchmarks. I had a question about that for the chief. There was a section under benchmarks where it talks about what the community is asking for in writing. Is also something along the lines of acceptable benchmarks. I'm very curious what sort of things you might, off the top of your head, be willing to propose as benchmarks for progress that the community is asking for. That was one question. And I'll wait and ask the other after.
So as far as benchmarks, I think that's part of the work that I hope that we're going to continue to do with OPO, equity, and innovation as we move forward. But I do think they all need to surround this issue of disproportionalities. And then as we get better at working with the data to understand those disproportionalities that are driven by officer discretion, that's when we start setting those absolute metrics and goals that we need to work towards eliminating any disparities, any disproportionalities that are the result of officers' independent actions by use of their discretion. So as we continue to work with the data, then that's exactly what we need to be benchmarking. And I think working with the group that did this report, along with Ms. Oliveras, I think that we will be able to put together some benchmarks that track that. And then I also think hearing from the community, and I know there's work being done by the Reimagine Task Force in this space as well, hearing from them what is important in regards to this topic so that we make sure that the benchmarks that are beneficial to us as the administrators over the organization are either inclusive of those that the community wants or supplement those that the community wants.
That's sort of my concern. That last bit of sentiment that you shared, that's my concern. You said beneficial to the administration and or supplement what the community wants. And so when I hear acceptable benchmarks, I'm looking forward to something tangible. I certainly don't want to ask you to come up with that now, but it's something I'd like very much to be able to follow. I think in theory, if you think about the practical application of like a community request, it's not supplemental, it's working in direct conjunction with, it's a collaborative effort, it's not like one gets the benefit, the other gets the supplement, and that's kind of how it sounds. So I just want to make sure that that's not the sentiment. Then the other question I had was about racial profiling and the training academy. Is there a module? Is there some coverage of racial profiling, its effects, and in the training academy?
So I will say yes, that it's covered, but without getting over my skis on this, I would prefer to follow up and give you the specifics on exactly how it's covered and where it's covered, so that I can be specific to what the curricula is on that topic. But right now I can tell you that it is something that we do cover with the cadets, but I can get you more specifics once I follow up with the instructors.
Yeah, I'd be curious to know how it's covered, where it's covered, how much time is spent on it. I mean, is it something that you spend a half hour on and then keep moving? I'd be curious about that. I'd also be curious to know if this data that folks are working so hard to produce will be included in future cadet class considerations, you know, just so they can sort of see how we got here and see where we're trying to head. I think it would be beneficial to include this data and these kinds of reports, the Tatum report, the audit that's going to come out. I think they should know, the department as it was, so when we do get future cadets, they should know where we were and then where we're headed. I think that would be beneficial information.
Certainly.
As we continue to do this work, and I know those of us on the committee are going to keep digging into this. Obviously, working with the chief and Farah. Brian, is the equity office kind of actively participating in this work moving forward, or should we keep looping you in as council members do this work?
We are actively participating, but always loop us in as well. And just to give you some insight into some of the other areas that we're working on, is that we are working to complete, to get out our first report on the first 5 divisions of APD that have gone through the racial equity assessment process. And one of those divisions is the training division. And so it could be a really good opportunity for us to come back and discuss some of the findings and have some conversations around some of the results of the first equity assessment tool, which I think sort of really connects well to, to the body of data that you're looking at too, and how we start to make those connections between it all.
Thank you, Brian.
What was the timing on that, Brian?
So we're hoping to have that draft out by the end of the month, or the first week of December.
Any further questions on this item? Okay, thank you.
Sorry, just to close it out on this, because you pointed out the Tableau thing, and I've been clicking on it a little bit for a moment here. Something that I think would be really useful when you look at the map. I think it is, again, I've only looked at it for 2 minutes, but I think it is shaded to highlight where there are a lot of Black and Latino stops. However, I don't think it's actually shaded. I think you have to click through to find where there's higher disproportionality of Black and Latino stops relative to the population of that zip code. So I think it would be really useful. I'm not going to call out any particular zip codes here, was so quickly looking at it, but there were some zip codes where it seemed like the Black and Latino population was very low, but the number of Black and Latino stops relative to that really low amount was considerable. It wasn't so many compared to, say, a Black or Latino neighborhood, because obviously there, it's primarily those folks living there, but I think it would be really useful to have a map or some level of information about how disproportionate the stops are relative to the people that live there.
Thank you, Councilmember. That would be pretty fascinating to dig into this and realize that perhaps the disproportionality is not happening where we think it's happening. It's really interesting. Okay, thank you all for that. Thank you, Brian and Farah and Carrie and Kim, for all of your excellent data analytics work.